Crossing the Threshold, From Dogmatic Slumber to Criticism, written by Felipe Bautista. My aim in the present text is to provide a straightforward account of the journey from dogmatic slumber to criticism. The journey begins with dogmatism, that is, with dogmatic slumber, then progresses on to skepticism, and finally, if the philosopher has put in the work and has made the necessary sacrifices, ends with criticism. What is dogmatic slumber? That is, what is dogmatism? Dogmatic slumber is the natural state one starts one's philosophizing in. One can spot a dogmatist from a mile away. How so? A dogmatic philosopher is always concerned with providing a description of reality as it is in itself. Hence, the dogmatic philosopher will characteristically always be found saying things like, reality is this, or reality is that. This is because of what Kant called transcendental illusion, or the natural tendency of reason to take the subjective necessity of a connection of our concepts, which is to the advantage of the understanding, for an objective necessity in the determination of things in themselves. The dogmatic philosopher is caught in a profound dogmatic slumber because of a natural and unavoidable dialectic of pure reason, not one in which a bungler might entangle himself through lack of knowledge, or one which some sophist has artificially invented to confuse thinking people, but one inseparable from human reason, and which, even after its deceptiveness has been exposed, will not cease to play tricks with reason, and continually entrap it into momentary aberrations, ever and again calling for correction. What does all of this mean? Allow me to make it clear. Imagine that you were sitting in the park on one warm and beautiful spring day, and imagine that suddenly a butterfly emerged, fluttering about across the air nearby. Now imagine that somehow you and that butterfly swapped bodies, such that now you were perceiving with butterfly eyes and sensing with butterfly sense organs. Of course, you will suddenly notice that everything appears different to you. Colors appear different, shapes appear differently, sounds are different, and everything about how you are experiencing will be entirely different. Why? Because you are now seeing through butterfly eyes and sensing with butterfly sense organs. In the same way, the butterfly, or more precisely the former butterfly, will now be seeing through the human eyes, which once were yours, and sensing with the human sense organs, which once also belonged to you. Kant famously stated that I can't have access to how things are in themselves. I can only have access to the representations that arise in the context of my own human experience, in the theater of my human mind. Just like how the butterfly can only have access to those representations that arise in the context of her own butterfly experience, in the theater of her own butterfly mind, so to speak. I use the example of swapping bodies to illustrate Kant's distinction between appearances, that is, representations, and things in themselves. When I swap bodies with the butterfly, I can only have access to the representations that arise in the context of butterfly experience. In the same way, when I return back to my human body after the swap has elapsed, and both I and the butterfly return back to our original bodies, I still cannot have access at all to things in themselves, but only to the representations arising in the theater of my human mind. The dogmatic philosopher is in a dogmatic slumber because he does not realize that he is always only interacting with the representations arising in the theater of his own human mind. When the dogmatic philosopher tells us that reality is this or that reality is that, he is only demonstrating his own naivety. The dogmatic philosopher saying that reality is this or that reality is that is the same as the prisoner in Plato's cave pronouncing that reality is shadows on a cave wall. The dogmatic philosopher thinks that he has access to reality as it is in itself. Hence, he is naive. He has not considered that he does not ever have access to how things are in themselves. All he has access to is to the representations arising in the theater of his own human mind. This is where skepticism, the next stage on our journey, begins. The dogmatic philosopher who has reflected deeply finally attains the awareness that what he is interacting with, when he interacts with houses, mountains, rivers, men, butterflies, etc., are only appearances, only representations arising in the theater of his own human mind. Hence, the question arises for him of how he can know that the world as it is in itself, outside the theater of his own human mind, corresponds to the representations arising in the theater of his own human mind. He realizes that since he cannot ever escape the theater of his own human mind, he therefore cannot compare the representations arising in his own human mind to reality as it is in itself, that is, to reality as it is outside the theater of his own human mind. Hence, the dogmatic philosopher has now awoken from his dogmatic slumber, and he has taken the next step on his philosophical journey. That is, he has moved from dogmatism to skepticism. What is there new in skepticism? Well, for one, the philosopher no longer pronounces dogmatically about how reality is this or how reality is that. Instead, he is now asking questions. That is, instead of dogmatically pronouncing about what reality is, he is asking himself about whether he can even know what reality is, or whether all he can possibly know are the representations arising in the theater of his own mind. A new form of dogmatism may begin to creep in at this point, however, namely, dogmatic solipsism. The skeptical philosopher may, after reflecting on his situation, come to the conclusion that reality is nothing more than the theater of his own mind. That is, he may conclude that there is no reality outside the theater of his own mind, and that all that exists is himself, and the thoughts and perceptions of his own mind. He may even go so far as to conclude that not even the past or future exist, and he may conclude that all that exists is the very present moment of consciousness. All that exists is the now of consciousness qua the now of consciousness. The skeptical philosopher turned dogmatic solipsist may say, or instead of dogmatic solipsism, he may adopt dogmatic idealism, according to which there are other minds beyond himself, or according to which there is only one infinite mind, and I am one of its accidents. Now, of course, both dogmatic solipsism and dogmatic idealism are regressions to dogmatism. Why? Because of a natural and unavoidable dialectic of pure reason. That is, because the philosopher has completely forgotten that he cannot say anything at all about what, if anything, there is beyond the theater of his own mind with apodeictic certainty, whether there are other minds or no, whether there is a single universal mind or no, whether the objects of the senses continue to exist after they no longer appear to the senses or no, etc. Once the philosopher has come fully to terms that he cannot ever possibly escape the theater of his own mind, and supposing that he refuses to lapse back into dogmatism, supposing that he refuses, that is, to regress back into either dogmatic solipsism, dogmatic idealism, or dogmatic transcendental realism, he then has two options. Either he can remain in skepticism, and therefore call into question the possibility of knowledge, or he can go on to the next stage of philosophy, that is, the stage of criticism. What is criticism? Criticism is a new kind of philosophy, totally different from dogmatism, and totally different from skepticism. How so? Well, notice that both dogmatism and skepticism have one thing in common, namely, transcendental realism. What is transcendental realism? In order to comprehend what we mean by transcendental realism, it will be necessary to distinguish between empirical and transcendental reality. What is the difference between empirical and transcendental reality? Empirical reality refers to the reality that appears within the theater of the mind. That is, empirical reality refers to the representations that arise in the field of one's experience. So the houses, mountains, rivers, men, and butterflies I perceive have empirical reality, because they are appearances arising in the theater of my human mind. In the same way, if I were to swap bodies with the butterfly, I would have access to an entirely new empirical reality. Perhaps there will not be houses, mountains, rivers, men, nor butterflies from the perspective of the butterfly, after I and the butterfly swap bodies, but there will nevertheless be something. There will be colors, sounds, perceptions, etc. In other words, the term empirical reality refers to what is real within the theater of the mind, qua representations in the mind. In turn, the term transcendental reality refers to what, if anything, is real beyond the theater of the mind. Of course, every sentient creature, for example, a man, a butterfly, etc., will have its own empirical reality, that is, will have its own theater of perceptions. But there is a difference between the objects arising in the theater of the mind, which objects are called phenomena, and those objects that are supposed to exist beyond the perception of any creature, which latter objects are called things in themselves. Again, notice how both the dogmatist and the skeptic philosophize in terms of transcendental reality. The dogmatist claims to know what transcendental reality is. Hence, he is a dogmatic solipsist who claims that transcendental reality is nothing at all, a dogmatic idealist who claims that transcendental reality is mental, or a dogmatic naive transcendental realist who claims that the objects of the senses continue to exist after they no longer appear to the senses. In turn, the skeptic too philosophizes in terms of a transcendental reality, but he only acknowledges that he cannot know anything about it. Hence, he doubts that knowledge is possible. That is, for him, the objects of the senses could be mere illusion because they may not correspond to reality as it is in itself outside the theater of his mind. What is the difference between these two former types of philosophy, that is, dogmatism and skepticism respectively, and the third kind, that is, criticism? Criticism is the final stage in philosophy. The philosopher who has gone through the first two stages, namely dogmatism and skepticism, finally reaches the final stage of philosophizing, namely criticism. What is characteristic about criticism, and how is criticism different from dogmatism and skepticism? Well, characteristic of criticism is its limitation, the critical philosopher, having already gone through the stages of dogmatism and skepticism, finally accepts that he cannot ever escape the theater of his own mind. But this is not something to be sad about. Rather, for the critical philosopher, it is something to celebrate. It means that he can now begin a new mode of philosophy, entirely new, the critical mode of philosophy. What is the critical mode of philosophy? It is the study of the theater of the mind, from within the theater of the mind. It is the study of consciousness, from within consciousness itself. The critical philosopher simply does not concern himself with what, if anything, there is external to his theater of perceptions and thoughts, whether other minds, a thing in itself, etc. Rather, the critical philosopher's aim is to study the very nature of his perceptions and thoughts. The difference between critical philosophy and dogmatism and skepticism is that criticism is not at all concerned with what there is independent of the theater of the mind. The critical philosopher is interested only in performing a deep and rigorous study of the theater of the mind itself, from within. The interesting thing about the critical philosopher is that he sees everything completely differently. The dogmatic philosopher, when he has a conversation with a fellow man, really believes that he is having a conversation with another sentient, intelligent being. In turn, the critical philosopher, when he has a conversation with a fellow man, is deeply aware that he is only interacting with his own thoughts, only interacting with the theater of his own mind. To get to the stage of the critical philosopher is no easy task. It requires the most difficult sacrifice of all, namely, it requires putting to the side one's human prejudices and one's human beliefs, and realizing that one is a mind ouroborically interacting with itself, ouroborically interacting with its own inherent representations. This, of course, does not mean that the critical philosopher cannot uphold the regulative validity of the idea of other minds on the basis of practical reason. On the contrary, he discovers that an essential component of the unity of experience is the appearance of moral activity. Now, of course, this does not mean, the critical philosopher realizes, that there are other minds outside the theater of his own mind, any more than Hamlet exists outside of Shakespeare's play, or any more than a butterfly's perceptions exist independent of the butterfly's theater of perceptions. The critical philosopher does not endorse metaphysical solipsism, to be sure, but he is aware that he cannot know anything at all about what, if anything, there is beyond the theater of his mind. The critical philosopher, unlike the dogmatic philosopher, does not say that there is this or that independent of individual consciousness. Rather, the critical philosopher is focused only on one thing, and one thing only, viz., deeply, rigorously, and methodically studying his own consciousness activity, the theater of his mind, from within, as it unfolds, all while avoiding dogmatic speculation about what, if anything, there is beyond the theater of his mind. In the words of Kant, all bodies, together with the space in which they are, must be considered nothing but mere representations in us, and exist nowhere but in our thoughts.